My stepmother Beatrice had a voice like spoiled cream, thick and cloying, and always on the verge of turning sour. It was a voice designed for public sympathy and private condemnation. That evening, as she adjusted the diamond clasp on my stepsister Rosalind's throat, she used it to paint the final, delicate strokes on the masterpiece of my worthlessness. "Elara, do try to be less present tonight. Find a nice dark corner, blend with the drapery. A girl with your unfortunate disposition, and that, mark, should cultivate the art of invisibility." The mark. She always called it that, as if it were a stain I had carelessly acquired. It was a thin, silver-white line that ran from the corner of my left eye to my hairline, a permanent little tributary of remembered pain. I touched it absently, the skin smoother and colder than the rest of my face. It was the one part of me that felt truly mine, a testament to a truth no one else in this house ever acknowledged. Rosalind, beautiful and bright as a newly minted coin, gave me a flicker of what might have been pity in the grand, gilded mirror. "Mother, that's unkind." Her pity was always fleeting, a butterfly touch that never lingered long enough to offer real comfort. She was not cruel like Beatrice, but she was a creature of the sun, and I, a creature of shadows. We did not, could not, truly understand each other's worlds. "It is not unkind, it is practical," Beatrice corrected, her fingers pinching Rosalind's shoulder in a gesture that looked like affection, but was, I knew, a warning. "We are securing your future tonight. Nothing can be allowed to distract from your radiance. Elara's presence is a charity we extend, not a right she possesses." My father, Lord Valerius, stood by the doorway, a ghost in his own home. He heard, of course, he always heard. But he was a man who had traded his spine for a quiet life, and the price of that peace was my silent suffering. He met my eyes for a fraction of a second, his gaze filled with a familiar, useless shame, before he looked away. That was his answer to everything, looking away. So I went to the ball. I wore a dress the color of dust, a hand-me-down from a previous season that had been deemed too drab for Rosalind. I found my corner, a small alcove behind a monstrous fern, and I practiced the art of invisibility. From my vantage point, I could see the entire glittering spectacle. The ballroom was a sea of jewels and silk, of calculated smiles and whispered ambitions. I watched Rosalind laugh, a sound like tiny bells, as handsome suitors orbited her like planets around a star. I watched Beatrice, her face a mask of triumphant matriarchy. I watched my father drift at the edges, a ship without a rudder. I was not sad. Sadness was a luxury I had long since learned to do without. It was an active emotion, and I was required to be passive. Instead, I felt a kind of detached numbness, the quiet resignation of a book left on a shelf, its story unread. My own world was far richer than this pantomime. It was a world of ink and parchment, of ancient maps and forgotten histories. In the quiet of my room, I could trace the journeys of forgotten explorers and chart the coastlines of imaginary continents. There, in the silent company of cartographers and scholars, I was not invisible. I was a traveler, a discoverer. Here, I was just the fern's silent companion. The evening wore on, a tedious parade of waltzes and champagne. I was so adept at my task that people began to use the alcove to have conversations they believed were private. It was how I learned which lord was on the brink of financial ruin and which lady was secretly in love with her stable boy. It was a lonely sort of omniscience. Then, the atmosphere in the room shifted, a subtle change in pressure, like the air before a storm. The music seemed to hesitate, the hum of conversation dipped. I peered through the fronds of the fern and saw the reason. Duke Alastair Beaumont had arrived. He was a man carved from granite and shadow. Taller than most, with a severe, unsmiling face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He was impossibly wealthy, impossibly powerful, and famously reclusive. A tragedy years ago, The death of his younger brother in a riding accident had supposedly locked away whatever warmth he might have possessed. He rarely attended such frivolous events, and his presence sent a ripple of shock and speculation through the room. Every ambitious mother, Beatrice included, sharpened her focus. The Duke was the greatest prize in the kingdom, a king in all but name. He moved through the crowd with a quiet, deliberate grace, nodding curtly to those who dared greet him, his expression unreadable. He ignored the fluttering fans and hopeful glances. His gaze swept the room, not with the air of a man looking for a dance partner, but with the intensity of a hawk searching for its prey. Beatrice, ever the strategist, steered Rosalind into his path. I saw her perfect practice curtsy, saw the brilliant smile she offered him. The Duke inclined his head, a gesture of the barest civility, and said something too low for me to hear. Rosalind's smile faltered for a moment before she recovered. He had dismissed her, not cruelly, but with an air of absolute finality. He moved on, leaving my stepmother and stepsister in a state of stunned disbelief. His slow, methodical path was taking him around the perimeter of the ballroom, toward me. My heart, a sluggish, dormant thing, began to beat a little faster. It was the fear of being seen, the fear of having my cultivated invisibility fail. I pressed myself further back into the shadows, wishing the fern were a forest. But he stopped. He stopped directly in front of my hiding place. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking not at me, but at the fern, as if he found it the most fascinating thing in the room. The small bubble of silence around him expanded, and people began to stare. They were not staring at him, but at the space he was commanding. At my space. Slowly, he turned his head, and his eyes, the color of a winter storm, met mine. They were not cold, as I had expected. They were analytical, penetrating. It felt as if he were looking past my dusty dress and my frightened posture, past the carefully constructed walls of my indifference, and seeing the very core of me. He saw the girl who charted imaginary stars and memorized the genealogies of forgotten kings. Then, his gaze lifted slightly, settling on the faint, silvery line beside my eye. His expression didn't change, but a new intensity sharpened his focus. The silence in the room became absolute, a held breath. My father, who had been hovering near a punch bowl, froze. I saw Beatrice's face pale with a rage she could not show. The Duke did not speak to me. He raised his voice, not shouting, but with a quiet authority that cut through the vast ballroom like a blade through silk. He addressed the room at large, but his eyes never left my face. "Who gave her that scar?" he asked. And every man in the room, including my father, looked away. The silence that followed was a living thing, heavy and suffocating. It was a silence of collective guilt, of willful ignorance, of 100 men who knew the answer, or suspected it, and had chosen for years to see nothing. Beatrice's face was a mask of fury, her knuckles white where she gripped her fan. Rosalind looked utterly bewildered, her social poise shattered. The Duke's question hung in the air, unanswered. It was not an accusation, it was a simple request for a fact, but delivered with the weight of a death sentence. He had not asked me, I realized. He had asked them. He had held a mirror up to their cowardice, and they could not bear the reflection. He took a step forward, into my alcove. The fern fronds brushed against his immaculate black coat. He was so close I could smell the clean, cold scent of winter air that clung to him. He extended a gloved hand, not to help me out, but as an offering, an invitation. "Your Grace," I whispered, my voice rusty from disuse. "I find myself in need of a partner for this waltz," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for me. "And you seem to be the only person in this entire room not actively engaged in a performance." My mind raced. To accept was to declare war on Beatrice, to shatter the fragile peace my submission had purchased. To refuse was to insult the most powerful man in the kingdom, But more than that, it was to retreat back into the shadows he had just pierced with a single question. It was to agree that I was invisible. I placed my trembling hand in his. His grip was firm, secure. He led me out of the alcove, and the sea of shocked faces parted before us as if by royal decree. As we stepped onto the dance floor, the stunned orchestra conductor finally regained his senses and struck up a waltz. He pulled me into the formal hold of the dance, his hand a warm, solid pressure on my back. I was clumsy at first, my body unaccustomed to anything but stillness. I kept my eyes down, fixed on the knot of his cravat. "Look at me, Elara," he said quietly. I started. He knew my name. Of course, he would have made it his business to know the names of Lord Valerius's daughters, but hearing it from him felt different. It felt real. I forced myself to lift my head. His eyes were still on me, unwavering. "You are a student of ancient cartography," he stated. It was not a question. My shock must have been plain on my face. How could you possibly know that?" A flicker of something, not quite a smile but a lessening of his severity, touched his lips. 3 years ago, at the Royal Geographical Society's annual lecture, a young woman in a plain gray dress asked Professor Albright a question about the disputed Mercator projection of the northern polar regions. A question so insightful it left the professor speechless for a full 10 seconds. I was there. I remembered the question, and I remembered the face of the woman who asked it. I remembered that day. It had been a rare escape, a day I had hoarded my tiny allowance for months to attend. I had been so engrossed in the lecture that I had forgotten my place, forgotten to be invisible. My question had burst out of me, a product of years of solitary study. The ensuing silence from the famed professor, followed by his grudging admiration, had been a secret, treasured memory. To think that he, Alistair Beaumont, had been there, that he had noticed, that he had remembered. "You remembered me," I breathed, the words a mix of astonishment and dawning wonder. "Intelligence is memorable," he said simply, guiding me through a turn. "Beauty fades. Wit can be rehearsed. But a truly inquisitive mind is a rare and precious thing. It is not something one easily forgets." For the duration of that waltz, the rest of the world ceased to exist. There was only the music, the solid frame of the man holding me, and the impossible reality that I was being seen. Not as the plain, scarred burden, not as Rosalind's unfortunate sister, but as me, Elara, the student of cartography. When the music ended, he led me not back to my corner, but toward the terrace doors. He paused only to retrieve a glass of lemonade from a passing servant, which he pressed into my hand. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. The sounds of the party faded to a distant murmur. He stood beside me at the stone balustrade, looking out at the manicured darkness of the gardens. He did not press for conversation, allowing me to gather the scattered pieces of my composure. My mind was a whirlwind. Why was he doing this? Was it pity? Some elaborate, cruel game? Or was it possible that he was exactly what he appeared to be? A man who valued intellect over artifice. The thought was so terrifyingly hopeful that I immediately tried to extinguish it. Hope was a dangerous country, and I had never been issued a passport. "Your stepmother is planning to marry you to Lord Finch," he said, his voice neutral. He might have been discussing the weather. I choked on my lemonade. Lord Finch was a corpulent, lecherous old man, thrice a widower, with a reputation for cruelty and a fortune that Beatrice desperately wanted to link to our family. It was a fate I had been dreading in the deepest, most silent parts of my soul. "She speaks of it," I managed to say, my voice tight, "as a suitable arrangement." "It is a transaction," he corrected, his tone hardening. "She means to sell you." He turned to face me, his silhouette immense against the distant lights of the city. "I have a counteroffer." I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "A counteroffer?" "Your father's estate is heavily mortgaged. The principal lender is a bank in which I hold a controlling interest. I could call in the debt tomorrow and leave your family destitute. Or I could forgive the debt entirely." The breath left my body. This was power. Not the petty domestic tyranny of Beatrice, but real, world-shaping power. "In exchange for what?" I whispered, fearing the answer. "A series of conversations," he said. "I wish to commission a set of maps from you, recreations of the lost charts of the explorer Silas Vane, a project of some academic interest to me. You would be required to visit my library at Blackwood Manor twice a week to consult my collection. Properly chaperoned, of course. For this, I will consider your father's debt settled." It was a preposterous, unbelievable proposal. A duke does not forgive a crippling debt for a few maps. This was an excuse, a meticulously constructed artifice to… what? To see me, to talk to me. It was so outlandish, so far beyond the realm of my experience, that I could only stare. "Why?" I asked, the words small and fragile in the vast night. He was silent for a long moment. "Because," he said finally, his voice lower, rougher than before, "no one should be made to stand in the dark, and I find the quality of your mind illuminating." The first visit to Blackwood Manor was a tense, formal affair. Beatrice insisted on chaperoning, her face a thundercloud of suspicion. She could not refuse the Duke's commission, not with the threat of financial ruin hanging over them, but her fury was a palpable force in the carriage. My father, as usual, had made himself scarce. The manor was like its master, imposing, grand, and steeped in a kind of solemn quiet. It was not a place of frivolous entertainments, but a fortress of solitude and history. We were met at the door by a severe-looking housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, whose expression mirrored the Duke's own. She led us through halls lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors to the library. And the library stole my breath away. It was 2 stories high, a cathedral of books. Sunlight streamed through a magnificent arched window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden sprites. The scent of old paper, leather, and beeswax filled the air. Ladders on brass rails ran along the towering shelves, promising access to worlds I had only dreamed of. In the center of the room was a massive oak table, already laid out with vellum, inks, and several of the Duke's rare collection of Vane's original journals. It was paradise. Beatrice sniffed, unimpressed. "Rather gloomy, isn't it?" The Duke emerged from the shadows between 2 towering shelves. "Lady Valerius, welcome. I trust your journey was comfortable." His tone was impeccably polite, yet it held a core of steel that forbade any of Beatrice's usual social maneuvering. He gestured to a small seating area by the fireplace. "Mrs. Gable will bring you some tea. Miss Elara and I have a great deal of work to discuss." He had effectively quarantined her. Beatrice was left with no choice but to seethe in silence by the fire, while the Duke led me to the great table. For the first hour, we spoke only of the task at hand. He was formidably knowledgeable. His questions about Vane's cryptic navigational notes and celestial charts sharp and insightful. He listened to my answers with an unnerving intensity, his gaze fixed on my face as I spoke. I found myself losing my nervousness, swept away by the subject I loved. For the first time in years, I was having a conversation with an intellectual equal. It was like a parched plant finally receiving water. "You believe Vane used a dual star system for his longitudinal calculations," he mused, tracing a line in one of the journals with a gloved finger. "The academic consensus dismisses that as fanciful." "The academic consensus has not accounted for the marginalia on page 47 of his private log," I replied, my voice gaining confidence. "He references a twin flame in the southern sky. It's not poetry, it's a navigational marker." He looked up from the book, and his eyes held a glint of what I could only describe as satisfaction. Precisely. In that moment, a bond was forged. It was not one of romance or flirtation, but of mutual intellectual respect. He was not indulging me, he was challenging me, engaging with me. He saw my mind, and he valued it. As the weeks passed, our sessions in the library became the focal point of my existence. Beatrice soon grew bored of chaperoning and sent Rosalind in her stead. Rosalind, to my surprise, was a quiet and unobtrusive presence. She would bring a book of poetry or some embroidery and sit by the window, occasionally looking over at us with a curious, unreadable expression on her face. The Duke, Alistair, as he insisted I call him in the privacy of the library, began to reveal more of himself. The work on the maps became a framework for conversations that roamed across history, philosophy, and art. I learned that his severe demeanor was a shield, forged in the aftermath of his brother's death. I was supposed to be with him that day, he told me one rainy afternoon, his voice low as he stared into the fire. I had some tedious estate business to attend to. I told him to go on ahead. I was impatient with him. He was young, full of life. I was always the serious one. He paused, his jaw tight. My last words to my brother were a dismissal. I have spent the last 10 years ensuring I never dismiss anything of importance again. His confession was a key, unlocking the mystery of his character. His obsessive attention to detail, his perceptiveness, his intolerance for social falsehoods, it all stemmed from that single tragic moment of inattention. He had missed the signs of a loose saddle strap, of a horse not fit to ride, and his brother had paid the price. Now he missed nothing. He had seen the truth of my family's cruelty in a single glance at a crowded ball because he had trained himself to see what others looked away from. I found myself responding with a vulnerability of my own. I spoke of my love for the silent, ordered world of maps, a world where everything had a place and a reason, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional landscape of my home. I spoke of the loneliness of having a mind no one cared to understand. I never spoke of the scar, and he never asked about it again. He did not need to. He knew it was a symptom, not the disease. One afternoon, our hands brushed as we both reached for the same inkpot. A jolt, sharp and startling, shot up my arm. He did not pull away immediately. His fingers rested against mine for a long, charged moment. I looked up and found him watching me, his expression intense, his stormy eyes filled with an emotion I did not dare to name. In that moment, the quiet, scholarly companionship between us deepened into something far more perilous. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Rosalind saw it. From her seat by the window, she saw the shift. Later, in the carriage on the way home, she broke the silence. "He is in love with you, Elara." Her words were so direct, so certain, that they shocked me. "Don't be absurd," I stammered, my face flushing. "The Duke is my patron. We share an academic interest." "No," she said, her gaze steady. "I have seen how men look at me my entire life. They look at me like I am a beautiful object they wish to possess. He does not look at you that way. He looks at you as if you are the answer to a question he has been asking for a very long time." She hesitated, then reached out and took my hand. Her palm was warm and soft. "I have been a fool, Elara, blind. I saw what Mother did, what Father allowed, and I told myself it was not my affair. I told myself you were content in your own way. But you are not, and you deserve to be happy." Her sudden empathy was a disarming, beautiful thing. It was the first crack in the frozen wall that had separated us for our entire lives. For the first time, I felt I had a sister. But our budding alliance and my fragile hope were about to be shattered. Beatrice had not been idle. She had seen the Duke's continued interest not as a strange whim, but as a direct threat to her plans for Rosalind and, more importantly, to her absolute control over me. If I were to marry the Duke, I would be elevated far beyond her reach. She could not allow that. Her campaign to stop it was a masterpiece of subtle cruelty. It began with whispers. Rumors spread through society that the reclusive Duke had been taken in by a cunning, grasping spinster. That the plain sister was an ambitious social climber, using a feigned intellectualism to ensnare a man still grieving his brother. When that failed to deter Alistair, Beatrice escalated. She began to actively sabotage my work. A rare book from the Duke's collection that I had brought home for study vanished from my room, only to be found days later, its spine broken, hidden beneath Rosalind's bed. Rosalind, horrified, swore she knew nothing of it, and I believed her. It was Beatrice's work, a cruel attempt to frame one sister and discredit the other. Alistair was furious, but not at me. "She is a venomous woman," he said, his voice cold with rage as he surveyed the damaged book. "This is not about a book, Elara. This is about control. She is trying to prove that you are untrustworthy, that you are a liability." His unwavering faith in me was a shield, but Beatrice's final attack was aimed directly at my heart. One morning, a letter arrived for the Duke, written in my stepmother's elegant, looping script. Alistair read it in my presence, his face growing harder and colder with every line. When he was finished, he did not look at me, but stared out the library window for a long time. Finally, he spoke, his voice dangerously quiet. "She claims your scar is the result of a violent, hysterical fit. That you threw yourself against a stone mantelpiece in a rage because your father refused to buy you a new gown. She claims you are mentally unstable, prone to delusions, and that your scholarly pursuits are a symptom of your madness. She warns me that you are a danger to yourself and others." The words struck me like physical blows. It was the most monstrous lie of all, a complete inversion of the truth, designed to poison the one thing I held most dear: Alistair's respect for my mind. I felt the floor drop out from beneath me. The fragile edifice of my new life, my new hope, crumbled into dust. Tears, hot and shameful, welled in my eyes. "It's not true," I whispered, my voice breaking. He turned from the window, and his face was no longer cold. It was filled with a terrible, contained fury. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and took my face in his hands. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "I know it is not true," he said, his voice a raw whisper. He brushed a thumb over the scar, his touch as light as a moth's wing. "I have spent weeks in conversation with one of the most lucid, rational, and brilliant minds I have ever encountered. This letter is not a diagnosis of you. It is a confession from her. It is the desperate act of a tyrant losing her grip." He released me and walked to his desk. "She has made a grave error. She believes my power is merely social and financial. She has forgotten that it is also informational. She has declared war, Elara, and I intend to end it." 3 days later, my father, Beatrice, and Rosalind were summoned to Blackwood Manor. The summons was not a request, it was a command. Beatrice arrived smug, believing her letter had worked, that this was to be the meeting where the Duke formally severed ties with me. My father looked anxious, as always. Rosalind looked at me with worried eyes, a silent promise of support. Alistair did not receive us in the library, but in his formal drawing room, a cold, imposing space dominated by a massive portrait of his grim-faced grandfather. I sat beside him on a sofa, a silent partner in the proceedings. He had instructed me to say nothing until he gave the signal. He began without preamble, his voice calm and precise. "Lady Valerius, I received your letter regarding Elara's mental state. I thank you for your concern." Beatrice preened. "Your Grace, I felt it my duty. The girl is fragile. We have always done our best to protect her from her own melancholic nature." "Indeed," Alistair said, his eyes like chips of ice. "Your protection has been so thorough that you have gone to great lengths to conceal the truth of her injury. An injury she sustained not in a fit of hysteria, but on the evening of her 15th birthday." Beatrice's smile froze on her face. My father flinched, as if struck. Alistair continued, his voice relentless. "You had arranged a small dinner. You presented Elara with a gift. A set of antique drafting tools, a foolish extravagance, you called it. A waste of money on a girl who should be learning needlepoint, not scribbling nonsense. You told her that her pursuits were unladylike and embarrassing." He was reciting the events of that night with chilling accuracy. I felt a tremor run through me. How could he know this? "When she defended her passion," Alistair went on, "you became enraged. You grabbed the heavy silver-handled magnifying glass from the set and struck her with it. "Lies!" Beatrice shrieked, her composure shattering. "Slander! The girl is delusional. She fell." "Did she?" Alistair asked softly. He gestured to a man standing quietly in the corner of the room, a man I had not noticed until now. He was older, with a kind, tired face. "Allow me to introduce Dr. Alwyn. He was the physician you summoned that night. He is a man of great integrity who has kept meticulous records for 40 years. He was troubled by your insistence that he record the injury as an accidental fall, especially given the nature of the wound. He made his own private notes. He is prepared to testify under oath that the injury was not consistent with a fall, but with a deliberate blow from a heavy, rounded object." Beatrice stared at the doctor, her face ashen. She looked trapped, a cornered animal. But Alistair was not finished. He placed a sheaf of papers on the table. "Furthermore, in my capacity as your primary creditor, I have had a team of accountants review your family's finances. They have discovered a rather interesting discrepancy. A trust, left by Elara's mother, intended for Elara upon her marriage or her 25th birthday. A trust you, Lady Valerius, have been illegally absorbing into your own accounts for the past 7 years. This is not merely a social slight. It is fraud. It is theft. It is a criminal offense." My father made a choked sound, burying his face in his hands. He had known. He had known about the money too, and had done nothing. The totality of his weakness, his complicity, was laid bare. "You have stripped her of her inheritance. You have abused her physically and emotionally, and you have tried to destroy her reputation," Alistair concluded, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You have done this to a woman whose intellect and character are worth more than your entire bloodline." He turned his gaze to me. It was the signal. For the first time in my life, I felt no fear. The years of silence fell away. I stood up and faced my stepmother. My voice was clear and steady, forged in the fire of his defense. "You tried to make me invisible," I said, looking directly into her horrified eyes. "But you failed. You tried to make me believe I was worthless, but you were wrong. This scar," I touched my face, my fingers tracing the line that had defined me for so long, "is not a mark of my shame. It is a mark of your cruelty, and I will not carry it in silence for you any longer. You are a thief and a liar, and you have no more power over me." Beatrice collapsed into her chair, a ruin of a woman, her mask of gentility finally destroyed. Rosalind rushed to my side, tears streaming down her face, and hugged me tightly. "I'm so sorry, Elara," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry." My father finally looked up, his face etched with a profound, soul-deep agony. "Elara," he whispered, can you ever forgive me?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. Forgiveness was a distant country, and I was not ready to make the journey. Alistair handled the rest with quiet efficiency. Beatrice was to be exiled to a remote country estate, her social life over. The stolen money would be repaid in full, with interest. Lord Valerius would sign control of the estate and its finances over to a trust managed for myself and Rosalind. He had not just defended me, he had liberated me. After they had gone, a silence descended on the grand drawing room. It was a clean, peaceful silence, free of tension and fear. Alistair came to stand before me. "It is done," he said. "You did this for me," I said, my heart overflowing with a gratitude so immense it was painful. "You saved me." "No, Elara," he said, taking my hands in his. His grip was warm and strong. "I did not save you. I merely provided you with the battlefield on which you could save yourself. Your courage, your voice, that was all you." He lifted one of my hands and pressed a kiss to the palm. "I have a final proposal, one that is not a business arrangement." He looked into my eyes, and all the severity, all the shadows were gone from his face. In their place was a raw, breathtaking vulnerability. "I have lived in a world of silence and duty for a decade. You have filled it with light and conversation. I find that I am unwilling to return to the quiet. Elara Valerius, your mind is the most beautiful thing I have ever known. Your heart is the bravest. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of being my partner in all things? Of letting me spend the rest of my life seeing you, just as you are? Tears streamed down my face, but for the first time in my life, they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. Yes, I whispered. Yes, Alistair. Always, yes. He smiled then, a true, brilliant smile that transformed his entire face, and it was like watching the sun rise after a very long winter. He leaned in and kissed me, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about recognition. It was the sealing of a promise, the end of a long journey out of the shadows. It was the feeling of being, at long last, completely and utterly seen. 1 year later, I stood on the wind-swept northern battlements of Blackwood Manor, a spyglass to my eye. I was not looking for ships or armies, but tracing the curve of the distant coastline, comparing it to the chart spread out on the stone beside me. A heavy wool cloak, the color of a summer sky, was wrapped around my shoulders, a gift from my husband. A pair of strong arms encircled my waist from behind, and the familiar chin rested on my shoulder. "The isobars are off by a fraction of a degree, are they not?" Alistair murmured, his breath warm against my ear. I smiled, leaning back against his solid warmth. "They are. Old Silas Vane was a genius, but his barometric instruments were rudimentary. I'm correcting the pressure gradient." "My brilliant Duchess," he said, his voice laced with affection and pride. He turned me in his arms to face him. The winter wind whipped a strand of my hair across my face, and he gently tucked it back. His gaze fell on my scar, as it often did, but there was no pity in his eyes, no curiosity, only a quiet tenderness. He traced the line with his thumb, a familiar, comforting gesture. To the world, I was the Duchess of Blackwood, a startling and unconventional match for the formidable Duke. But here, with him, I was simply Elara. We had built a life together in the quiet halls of his ancestral home, a life filled with books and maps, with spirited debates that lasted long into the night, and with a deep, abiding peace. Rosalind was a frequent visitor, her friendship a source of unexpected joy. We had found the sisterhood that had been denied to us as children. She was happily married now to a kind man who loved her for her gentle heart, not just her pretty face. My father lived quietly on a smaller dower property, writing long, remorseful letters that I was finally beginning to find it in my heart to answer. Beatrice remained in her gilded cage in the country, a bitter, forgotten woman. Her name was never mentioned. "What are you thinking about?" Alistair asked, his stormy eyes searching my face. "I was thinking about the color of invisibility," I said softly. "I used to believe it was the color of dust and shadows, but I was wrong." "And what color is it now?" he prompted. I looked up at him, at the man who had asked a question in a crowded room and changed the course of my world. The man who had seen a mind where others saw a flaw, and a strength where others saw a scar. "There is no such color," I said, my heart full. "Not anymore."